Hi, my name's Warren. I'm one of the co-founders at 33 and welcome to another episode of the 33 vlog. Today's guest is a man I first met through an app. How 21st century is that? His name's Neal Henderson and he is an elite endurance and performance coach. His CV is serious. This is a guy who's worked with multiple Olympic athletes, Tour de France riders, stage winners, hour record holders, and many other Olympians. Along the way, he's also worked with ice hockey teams, as I discovered, which made for an interesting diversion in our conversation. Safe to say, what Neal Henderson doesn't know about endurance performing and taking the body to its limits over distance, pretty much, quite likely, isn't worth knowing. But like I said, my first contact with Neal came through an app. That app was Sufferfest, the cycling training app. Something that I've really enjoyed using. Now I say enjoyed carefully because, as the name suggests, bits of it are brutal. But if you're looking for real maximum bang for buck in your turbo training time, I really do think Sufferfest is something that is hard to beat, both for enjoyment factor, there's enough in there to keep you going back, but for push factor. Once it's learnt your data through its fitness test, what it gives you back in your own tests is really going to take you to the edge. And given that for me, as I'm sure for many of you, life is very, very busy building, growing and running this company. My professional life is stacked. I have a personal life as well alongside that. But I do love my training and I've got some race goals this year. Sufferfest was the place where I knew I could get a couple of hours in a week that were really going to make a difference on top of everything else. Anyway, Neal is the man behind all of their training programs and all the science behind that. That's through his company Apex Coaching. And at Sufferfest they call him an evil genius, and honestly I think that's exactly what he is. But more than that, what Neal really has is an incredible passion for coaching. It's not just something he does, he lives, breathes, eats and sleeps it. I do believe if Neal could immerse himself in the world and execution of high-level elite performance coaching for endurance and otherwise, I think he would do it 24/7, 365, and he would be as happy as a pig in insert your chosen swear word here. So all of that made this conversation a real delight. If you're looking to just bolster your own performance knowledge and mindset and your toolkit of things you can do during training, then there's tons in this conversation for you. But if you're also looking to balance that fine line between overtraining and getting the most out of yourself, if you're looking to understand when maybe you should back off, when maybe you could go harder, this podcast and this show is really going to deliver in spades for you. And that is exactly what our mission is here at 33. We're all about giving athletes the best possible tools to raise their game to the next level. And we do it by sharing great content like this with incredible minds like Neal. And we also do it in store with our incredible range of natural sports nutrition products. You can check them out at 33fuel.com. With all that said, let's get into this conversation with Neal Henderson. Fancy seeing you here. I haven't spoken to you for ages.
It's been forever. Feels like a long time.
It's been literally minutes, I think.
Possibly seconds.
So here you are in Apex Coaching HQ, which you've just been kind enough to give me a tour of. Not only does it look like a totally pimped out coaching and training lab with every piece of equipment and piece of tech and piece of measurement you could possibly want, with almost no flab. I can't see anything in there that doesn't serve a severe purpose. And like I said, you've been there 3 years. You've been doing Apex Coaching, for a long time, but out on your own for a few years now. You look as excited to be there as a kid who just got given that for Christmas about 5 minutes ago. And I think that speaks volumes about what you do and why you do it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's something that I would, to say I'm passionate about it is probably an understatement. I got into the field. Really, I kind of decided I wanted to do this as a teenager. One of the few people out there that kind of knew what they wanted to do and went for it and stayed on the track and has been fortunate enough to be able to fully be immersed in it, probably even at a bigger and higher level than I even thought I could in the very beginning. So.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting theme on its own to get into. You say, maybe a bigger and higher level than you thought you could. We could go into a whole series on, belief and how do you achieve those things, and, how does that journey unfold. But I thought the place I really wanted to start, because you're a coach and you've coached at a very high level, you still do, but you're a very good athlete yourself. Now, where does Coach Neal and athlete Neal, where do they begin? Where do they meet, and how do they balance out, and how does that journey play out for you?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty interesting way of looking at things. That in the very beginning, as a kid, I was like most others who did a lot of different things, played a lot of different sports, and some of them I was pretty terrible at, but I continued to do. Like baseball, I played baseball and was not very good at it. I kind of enjoyed it. I had friends there, and it was a team thing. So I played for a number of years. Soccer, I played for a long time, or football, as most other people. Not American football, which I did play 1 year of in high school, which was a bad decision. But played soccer and got cut from a high school team, and that kind of frustrated me, and that's why I ended up playing American football the year after. I wouldn't do that again, but I did it and I learned something. And even, something like basketball. I'm not very tall. If you meet me in person, I'm not even 5'10". And so playing basketball in fourth grade, a buddy of mine and we played a 2-on-2 league, and we got the sportsmanship award, which means basically you got beat week in and week out, but you kept showing up. And so, there's things that I learned from a young age. I'd say, that's what, as a fourth grader, you're, 9, 10 years old. I learned a lot of things about, sport and life that I continued then into getting into some of the sports that I became a little bit, better at. And again, was I better at doing some of those things because of, not having great successes elsewhere, but I was able to learn, say, how to throw discus by watching others and by looking at videos of people throwing discus. And pole vaulting, we had no pole vault coach, but it's something I wanted to do. And we had one kid who was pretty good, and I watched him and learned from him, and basically took it upon myself to try to be a better athlete by watching others, learning, reading, all of those things, any way that I could pull information in to help me be better at the things I was trying to do.
Interesting.
So that's kind of the one part of, for me as an athlete, it's been always taking from whatever, opportunities there were. If you look, when I was young, 30, 40 years ago, we didn't have quite the same, you couldn't pull up YouTube and watch, a video of the 10 best pole vaulters pole vaulting. That was not a possible thing. And so, there was lots of different, ways of doing things. And some of it is just failing repeatedly and learning what doesn't work before you find out what does work.
Well, it's only failure when you don't get up, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's all part of it. Then I had the good fortune of having a really good coach who actually had an exercise and sports science background. And she was my swimming coach in high school. And her husband was a postdoctoral research fellow in cardiac physiology. And so she would introduce a little bit of the why we were doing certain things with our training and swimming and tapering, and even gave me scientific papers because I was asking, well, why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? And she helped open the door for me, which was absolutely massive. And another thing, that I had a short trip when I was, I think I was 16 years old. My parents and my younger sister and we drove around the United States in a Volkswagen bus, and stopped in many places around the way. I grew up in Pennsylvania, which is on the East Coast, but we did stop in Colorado Springs at the Olympic Training Center, did the tour. And afterwards, I asked if there was anyone I could talk to learn more about what they did in the sports science building, because that was, in my head, like, I think I want to do that. I have this interest. And they said, well, let me see. They walked over, and there was a PhD biomechanist who basically showed me around what was going on in the physiology lab, what they had going on in the biomechanics lab, and they were looking at race walking. And the American race walkers were not doing very well on the international stage. And so the biomechanists there were breaking down what the differences were from the successful race walkers, many of them European competitors versus the American competitors. And ultimately, it was that the Europeans were actually getting airtime. They weren't actually truly walking, but the way the sport is judged, it's a visual judging, not a video replay. And
Because
so,
technically in a
and that's at
race
the
walk,
time,
do you have to have one foot
2
must
feet.
always
Yeah, you have to have ground contact.
at all times,
And
right?
so airtime is running.
But the
But
Europeans are hiding a little bit of airtime in there. That's
just a little bit. They had the way that that visually it wasn't being detected by the judges. And so the Americans had to learn that technique based on that. So for me, that was really an interesting, not that I'm, into race walking per se, but the application of being able to look at things in that way was really pretty cool. And so I went to school in my undergraduate studies. I actually started off in mechanical engineering based on that because I really wanted to get hardcore into the biomechanics and the engineering part of it. And second year into the advanced math stuff at a very big engineering university at Penn State, I was realizing that my limits in terms of math were definitely going to hold me back as an engineer. And fortunately, I'd already been taking some of the sports science classes, which I was going to have a minor in, and ultimately decided to make the switch over out of the hardcore engineering side of it to a little bit more into the science of the sports science.
and human engineering.
Yep. And, I did triathlons. I did actually decathlon when I started at Penn State. I tried to walk onto the team, but again, like I said, I'm not very tall. High hurdles are about chest high for me. So trying to run 110 meters with those high hurdles, really, I lost a lot of points comparatively in a decathlon, and same with the high jump. I just, being shorter, you can't jump as high in that way. And it's absolute points relative to a world record is how the scoring was done. And so I had less success in the decathlon than I wanted, so I dropped off from a 10-sport event down to a 3-sport event with triathlon, and kind of went from there.
Well, you were a pro triathlete for a spell as well, weren't you?
Yeah,
This is
yeah.
not just I did
So
some triathlon. That's sort of more than most people will ever do.
yeah, I haven't gotten a good count, but I've done somewhere between 200 and 300 triathlons in my career. Have to look back and count them all up. But yeah, I was actually president of the Penn State Triathlon Club when I was there in my undergraduate studies, and was very, very into it. I graduated in, I can't even remember now, 1994, 1995. I think 95, and in 96, I was working at Penn State Center for Sports Medicine in Hershey, Pennsylvania, which is kind of my hometown. Yes, that's where the chocolate is
I
from.
was
So it's kind of
about
like
to
Willy
say,
Wonka.
I'm aware of Hershey's not as a place. I'm aware of it as a chocolate bar.
It is, and it smells like chocolate. And there's also the Reese family that's in Hershey, like Reese's Pieces, Reese's peanut butter cups. So you can smell both, the peanuts and the chocolate. And when it's really high humidity and the wind's going the right way, you get both together, and that's lovely, I think. Maybe not the best in those high humidity, hot days in the summer. Try to do, hill repeats. Not quite as pleasant to
I was
have
about to
too
say,
much
do
of that
those
aroma.
two families know each other? Is there a great
Oh yeah, yeah.
great
There was
Hershey
maybe a little bit
rivalry?
of, at some point. I'd say going back, they had a little bit more rivalry going. I think now
Well,
they're on
maybe
friendlier
that
terms, we'll
rivalry
say.
though drives competition, right? You don't get the best out of you without a
Yeah,
little bit of competition, and maybe that's what took the two of
exactly.
them as far as they've gone.
Yep, Dave Scott and Mark Allen.
Like Hershey and Reese's, I'm not sure it's a comparison they'd appreciate, but I think it's a good one.
People might not, yeah, they might not draw the same, comparison that we see, but I see it.
Definitely.
Um, But yeah, so within that sport, and triathlon was young at the time, and 96 was the first national teams for triathlon. It didn't enter the Olympic program until the year 2000 in Sydney, but I volunteered for a couple weeks. I came out to Colorado Springs just on my own dime, took 2 weeks off of work, and just volunteered to learn how they were coaching it. Because, there wasn't really any coaching manuals in triathlon in 1996. And so for me, it was an opportunity to be around the best, learning from some of the best. And I was able to, fortunately, again, take some of that knowledge that I was able to gain out there and take other things. I was actually working as a strength and conditioning coach for the Hershey Bears, which was an AHL hockey team. I never played hockey in my life. Last time I skated, prior to that, I'd gotten a concussion, falling down and hitting my head on the ice. So, skill wise, there was nothing I could relate to on that. But they actually use cycling for their off ice conditioning,
No way.
stationary bikes. And so I was like, well, that's something I know how to do. And so we were working on having specific training, prepping them. And that team ultimately did win the Calder Cup, which is the Stanley Cup of the minor league of the AHL. And
For
so,
anyone
it was
who's
one
not
of those
aware, the
things.
Stanley Cup would be like the FA Cup is to the British football teams, you know. So
Yeah,
that's the top of the ice hockey league in Canada, and well, it's the top of the ice hockey league, isn't it? In fact, it's a big deal in
US and
Canada. It
Canada.
may have come from there, but I'm not sure that Canadian teams tend to win it as much anymore as teams from the USA.
Yeah, we've been able to come out on top a few more times, but there's still plenty of international players. There's folks
Yeah.
coming in from all throughout Europe and elsewhere too, into the NHL. But
Yeah.
it was one of those great experiences of again learning how to apply sports science and physiology into a sport that I didn't do by using something that I did know a little bit more.
That's
And
interesting.
so for
Does
me, this marriage of being an athlete and being a coach and being a sports scientist, I can't pull one piece out from another. They are all interconnected and interrelated.
Well, it certainly looks and seems and feels like you've landed in exactly the right place. But I'm fascinated by the way that you, in that early part of that journey, you're leapfrogging into sports you don't know. Now, how does how do people react when you've got a guy who literally can't skate coming in to coach ice hockey players? Because I can see on the one hand, you bring knowledge they don't have simply because you're not from their world. That can give you it gives you an advantage. You see
Yeah.
things they don't see. It gives you a disadvantage. Do they take you credibly? How did you balance those two things as you crossed that chasm?
Yeah, for me, it was an interesting thing, and I mean, you have to come in with the right attitude that you're there to help. So anything that you're doing as a coach, as a sports scientist, is you're trying to help the athletes be better. So for me, it's always an athlete-centered situation of what I'm trying to do. I look at what they are doing, what maybe they aren't doing, and what they could do differently or better. And so day one of actually with the ice hockey team, the coach came in and he was a new coach into the professional leagues. He had been extremely successful through the junior leagues in Canada, which again means you're a pretty high level coach. Canada being one of the best hockey nations in the world, and so he walks into where the bikes and where the athletes I was with. And he said, "Okay, I want them to do 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off at this resistance for 30 minutes. Thanks." And he walks out. I was like, okay, guys, you heard coach, here we go. And I have a whistle and I'm whistling every 30 seconds. And man, I was pretty punishing. Now, I won't say that I haven't had athletes do workouts that are similar to that, like, 3 sets of 10 times 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off at specific intensities for the work and the rest, and then some recovery in between. But that 30 minutes straight on and off was pretty brutal. And that was day one. And so for me, and in my head, as I'm doing this, I'm like, I got to talk to him. Like, this is not, I'm not here to make exercises punishment. And in some cases, certain sports have used that, whether it's, running hills or running laps or doing sprints on the bike. It's like almost exercise as punishment. And for me, it's like, no. Gaining fitness should be a positive, not a negative in any way. And you should be rewarding and looking at the advantages that can provide for you. So after that first practice, I went it was Bob Hartley, and said into his office. I said, listen, I know you know way more about hockey than I do. I don't really know much about it, but I do understand the work-rest ratios, how the energy systems work, and I know indoor cycling and what we're doing and how I can help the team gain fitness and be at their best when the playoffs come. And
Which is
I
the
said
goal
it would
he's
be
looking
different.
for.
Yeah,
So you framed
exactly.
it
So
in
it's
terms
like
of his goal.
we have a shared goal. Yeah, we have a shared goal at this point. And he said, okay, well, tell me more. I said, well, what I would want to do is lay out a training program that's going to be varied over time. It's not going to be the same kind of thing like I just did today. We may do something like that every now and then, but that's not that's not going to be bread and butter of it. It's going to be some days that are going to be truly easy. Some days will be truly hard like that. There will be some stuff in between, but there's going to be progression so that, again, at the important time of the season, that everyone is operating at their best. And he said, well, you get 2 weeks your way, and if I don't like it, it's back to mine. I said, okay, I
That's
got
all you
2
can
weeks.
ask for, right?
Exactly. Give me an opportunity. I'm a 20, I was probably 22, 23-year-old kid. Again, I had volunteered with the national team and, but I have no real resume to my name. I was maybe a national class triathlon competitor, but that really means nothing to a professional ice hockey coach. It's like, okay, that's nice. You can swim, bike, and run. Yeehaw. But again, framing it in a way that I was there to help him, help the team, help all the players there. And so I wrote, a basic schedule of what the progression would look like and detailed the first 2 weeks and showed it to him before the next practice. And he's like, okay, well, let's see. And the guys, again, liked it because it wasn't exercise as punishment. It was different. Yes, there were hard days, but I won the players over as well. And again, a lot of those dudes are, they're 6'4", which again, I don't know, it's almost 2 meters or something like that. And they weigh 200 some pounds.
They're not shy. I know they're wearing a lot of protection at the time, but they're not shy of taking a punch or giving one either.
Absolutely.
So I guess they're not going
part
to
of the game.
They're not. Yeah, exactly. If they don't like it, they've got every means of just saying we're not going to do it.
Yeah. What am I going to do? 165 pound, skinny little guy. But it was again, I was there to help them. And Bob accepted it, Bob Hartley, and the team had success. And actually, Bob Hartley came up to the NHL and he did win a Stanley Cup with the Colorado Avalanche, which, that was the Hershey Bears were the Avalanche's AHL team. And coincided with the same time that I came out to graduate school at CU Boulder and continued to work with the Avalanche until about 2010 as a consultant with some of their off-ice conditioning and testing protocols and things they would do.
Nice. So, I didn't realize there was a whole ice hockey side to your resume.
Yeah, I've been able to test Peter Forsberg and Patrick Waugh and, just some of the best hockey players ever and see them and get to interact with them and, again, learn, from absolute superstars, multi-million-dollar players, franchise players, and people at the top of their game. And just, again, if you can take a little something away here and there,
that's how you build up.
Apply it elsewhere.
I clearly in the UK, we are not a great ice hockey nation. We don't have a great tradition of it. I have family in Vancouver and spent a lot of time out there, been to a few games, obviously aware of the Stanley Cup, this, that, and the other. What I had never realized, I realized it's a fast game. I hadn't realized that it seems to be so fast that they are changing the players almost constantly because the players only seem to operate at a sprint intensity.
Yes.
But they're not small guys and they're wearing a lot of gear. How do they manage that, and what is the specificity to their training, or what are the attributes that they need to gain in order to be able to do that? Because I just never realized it looks a bit more graceful until you watch closely. As actually, that's kind of like 9 out of 10 permanently on an effort scale.
It is. Yeah, so generally shifts, are well under 2 minutes. That's a long shift, penalty killing. Long shift, they might be on the ice, 60 to 90 seconds. And in that, it's 20 to 40 seconds are absolutely full gas, all out. And so there's a neuromuscular absolute, peak power component, the acceleration, first 3 steps, 1, 2, 3. First 3 strides, explosive power, you either have it or you don't. And if you don't have it, somebody else beats you to the puck when it's close. So there's that initial part and that ability to repeat that. So there's a high neuromuscular load there. So absolute strength and peak power are going to be highly associated with success. So we have to address those things. So there's weight training that's done. Strength training, Olympic lifts, cleans, squats, all those type of, foundational strength motions are part of things. The second part, really from a more physiological standpoint, then you have kind of an anaerobic capacity. So lactate is a byproduct of breaking down carbohydrate without oxygen. When you need energy rapidly, that's the fast way that you can continue after those first 3 strides to push hard. And so for a 6, 8, 10-second effort, then you're dipping into that anaerobic capacity side of things. You're producing a ton of lactate. Lactate in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's just a problem when you're producing more than you can clear. And so from a physiological perspective, we look at then that baseline aerobic fitness, threshold fitness, critical power, whatever you like to call that point, sustainable, is how you can enhance your clearance from
in
dipping
terms of
into
getting
that
rid
system.
of the lactate. So
Yep. So when they sit on the bench, that recovery, the higher baseline level of aerobic fitness they have, the better repeatability they have from shift to shift to shift.
And what would be, just roughly as a ballpark figure, how long is a player going to be on the ice in an ordinary game? Total amount of minutes or seconds played, and
Yep.
roughly what size gap are they getting between shifts in terms of recovery time?
Yeah, the recovery time is going to be, from shift to shift, anywhere from a minute and a half to about 4 minutes,
So
depending
basically
on,
nothing.
Situation and what's going on. Yeah, it's minimal.
I
It's
bet it
minimal.
feels like nothing.
Yeah, and then on ice time, basically 30 to 90 seconds
Each
per shift,
shift.
with 2 minute being that kind of really on the upper limit, penalty
And how
kill
many
kind
shifts
of
do you
thing.
think they do in a game? I mean, roughly.
Uh, I mean, they're going to be there. There's typically three lines, and so some of those lines do have players that are on a little bit more of the time. But over the entire course of the game, at least 20 some minutes of time out of that 60 minutes are them
Full
on
gas.
and going pretty much full.
Wow.
So heavy effort.
That's serious. But then you're certainly in the context of this conversation, the context of Apex coaching and what you do, the majority of the work you're known for is work in endurance, with cycling, with triathlon.
Yeah.
Now, I get that this was a part of what you did. Are there lessons that you took from hockey that you then bring into endurance? Because it's interesting, you go the one way with the ice hockey, and you're the person who doesn't know anything about it, but now you're very much the person who knows everything about it. Who in cycling knows anything about ice hockey? I'm going to guess that's not many. And like you said, if you just take one thing, were there any crossover things you're like, hey, that's working well in hockey. Here's a totally different sport, but this is an overlooked element. Was there anything like that in there?
Yeah, for me, a lot of the bringing the strength side of things and neuromuscular training and power into what we do with endurance sports, and thinking about the sustainability. So a lot of times the hockey teams are playing 3, sometimes even 4 times a week. And it's very, it's physical, not just the intensity of it, but the physical collision, the hits, all of those things that are components of it that, again, we don't really have in triathlon. There's not too much contact going on, inadvertent maybe in the swim at most. And so
road cyclists
it's a
take
different,
their share of
so
knocks,
a little
though.
bit, yeah, you're going to hit the ground typically is where that happens, and contact with ground and, recovery. So recovery is a component that we looked at and paid attention to in the season as a high priority, as well as then that pure strength and neuromuscular conditioning, because the stronger you are to a very large degree, the more you can repeatedly tolerate a high load. And so that load either is your training or your racing. So in triathlon fatigue, we break down our mechanics, and when our mechanics break down, then we're using poor form, and the potential for injury goes way up. And so having foundational strength is critical. And so for me, that strength carrying over to the importance of staying healthy is important. And it's not just, the muscle. So people always think of strength training as, I'm just trying to affect this muscle here. No, it's actually the tendon more so than anything else. If you think of what we try to do in endurance sports, the reason why we do some of the strength training.
The tendon will break before the muscle will.
Tendinitis, right? Yeah. All the different types of things. It's that tendon as a weak point in many cases. And so when we increase the strength of the muscle, we are also increasing the integrity of that tendon as well. And so now the tendon can tolerate the load that the muscle is generating for a longer period of time before breaking down and becoming a problem.
Interesting.
And so the carryover and crossover for me come into then the injury prevention, which if you're not injured, you can be more consistent in your training and you can make greater gains. When you're inconsistent in your training, you don't make as many gains. If you have to take off 2 weeks every, 8 weeks, you're not going to do as well as if you get 10 continuous weeks of training.
Yeah. And so on that strength side, I think this plays into a lot of, triathletes, a lot of runners, particularly people who are in, runners, cyclists, triathletes, focus on the discipline, the swimming, the cycling, the running, whatever it may be. And the weight room that's for someone else.
Yep, foreign concept.
Yeah, in the same way that the stereotypical bodybuilder wears bodybuilding pants because he never does leg day because it'd be better to do arms and back or whatever.
Yep.
I'm stereotyping with a broad brush, but we've got the two sides of the equation there. How much can your everyday triathlete, runner, cyclist benefit from incorporating some weight and resistance work into their performance, and how many even do enough?
Yeah, for me to say that it's integral again is an understatement. It's not optional. For the young athletes, for them to be able to tolerate the load. So when I'm talking about the elite, Olympic format, Olympic, athlete, professional, for them, it's the capacity to tolerate the training load to be successful at that level and stay healthy. For when we get into, middle age, 30s, 40s, 50s, it's about, again, staying healthy more so and balanced, especially as we get into those 40s and 50s, strength levels are declining. And if you are focusing on endurance, you're actually going to be dropping strength at a greater rate than if you were sedentary. Endurance training decreases or retards or accelerates strength loss.
Interesting. So as you are getting older and doing more endurance training, you're
getting weaker.
You're going to accelerate strength loss, even if your running and stuff looks okay.
Yes. Muscular endurance and muscular strength are separate things. So you can have very endurance capable muscles that are pretty weak. And if you do something just a little bit different, little too much, you can unravel pretty quickly.
Up comes your injuries.
And so when you have somebody who's been doing the same thing for decades, I've been doing this for 10 years or 20 years. I've been running marathons for, 15 years. I've had people say, and I never had a problem. Well, you took a 15-year pathway to have a massive problem, not a little problem. We can fix this, but it's now going to take some time. And you're going to have to change what you did comparatively in those prior 15 years. Incorporating strength training may mean in many cases that your total training volume, hours per week, distance per week goes down, but your capacity can go up. People get so stuck on, I need to run this many miles, I need to train this many hours to get ready for an Ironman, all those kind of things. It's all in their head in most cases, and it's not true.
So
people make out too much in terms of hitting certain specific things. I won a marathon, not a highly attended one, but I ran a 3-hour 20 marathon on trails at high altitude with a single longest run of 16 miles the weekend before it. I was like, okay, I'm ready. I had been doing, 80 and 100-mile bike rides every couple of weeks. And so general endurance was there. I had specific fitness. It was a pretty hilly course. I was able to actually drop the other guy who was going for the win at mile 20 on a steep uphill. I ran the uphill and he had to walk it. And he was a skinny runner guy and I was, a bigger, stronger triathlete. Success can come from different ways. Just get outside of the box and don't follow what everyone else has done always is an important thing.
I think that's a great insight. And I think also the strength point is fascinating that so you're just saying the idea that people would, if you're in that situation where you've always focused on endurance and now it's time, you're going to need strength, you're behind the curve on that, the metrics are going to change. Your weekly mileage is going to go down. Your ratio of what you're training is going to change. But follow the process, and if you do it correctly, you will still see or are likely to still see gains at the end of it, even though everything felt different and felt wrong because your usual metrics that you use for, let's say, success, you're not seeing those figures in training. But when you get to the race day, you've built a better result. Is that right?
You've built the capacity to do that. And so that's the other thing. Sometimes in training, people often try to test themselves too often in training. I liken it to like touching that fitness. Like, I just want to make sure I can do it. I just want to make sure I can do it. I'm keep doing it, but then it goes away if you're always trying to prove that you can do it. If you do too much of that, you kind of run out, and there's a motivational capacity to that. If you're always having to dig really deep in training when it comes to a race, You might not just have that extra gear motivation wise to dig that deep. So in training, I always say, generally you want to leave one more of the highest quality effort that you did in that session in you.
And
don't go to your absolute limit. Go to the point where you could do one more, but don't. And there's a confidence there. And then there is that ability that you don't dig so deep that you can barely recover from it. So that's the other thing in training. If we look over time, a lot of people, training makes you worse, right? Any given training session makes you slower, weaker, less capable of doing things to some degree. So training makes you initially slower, worse, etc. It's only when you recover that even you can get to the same baseline or have a super compensation or an improvement in performance if you have enough rest and recovery. And so too many people just break down so deep that they can only get to where their starting point is. And it looks like a sine wave over time. It doesn't go up. The trajectory is a straight line. Same level of performance, early season, late season, and everything in between is right on that flat line. I want to see gains. I want to not dig maybe as deep if the recovery can bring me to a higher level. I might not have to dig as deep to get that kind of recovery. It's about adaptation and improvement, not workload. So I look at the rate of gain. And in many cases, if we can do the least work to get the most improvement, we have room to grow. If we go to the most load we can tolerate, we may or may not get better. In some cases, you may tolerate it a little longer, but not necessarily get better.
And I guess all sports are the same, but I'm most familiar with the endurance world and just the name. It's about endurance, right? It should be hard. It should be tough. And then you throw in a bit of macho type A, no pain, no gain. And we've got a bit of a recipe for disaster in there. But I love your idea of maybe going that little bit lighter, but prioritizing that recovery and that visual picture you paint of the upward curve as opposed to the flat curve, because you're constantly depleting yourself so much through training that your recovery only brings you back to where you started. Therefore, over the course of the year, you haven't gone anywhere. You've been very busy. You've done a lot of work. You've hit your numbers. There's maybe identity and pride and all sorts of things tied up in that.
Yeah.
But did you get better?
Exactly.
Now,
how
do you start to unlock the better? And I get, there's a Pandora's box in here. This could be a volume encyclopedia, particularly based on your knowledge and the people you've worked with. But what are some basic ways that you start to tip that curve into an upward trajectory?
Yeah, so you have to have some objective measurements that you can make. Assess where are you at now, and then reassess 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks later, objectively. So there's tests, things like we do, like with, say, the Sufferfest, the full frontal test session. It's not something you want to do every week. You don't even want to do it every month. Literally 2 or 3 months between is good. But it's an objective check.
About it, it's a painful session, and that's something we can talk a little bit about. I understand, as David, who founded the Sufferfest, said, you are the evil genius behind the program. So I've felt the pain behind them, but I've seen the results. And so that fitness test as a thing, you're right, definitely don't want to do it every day. But tell us a bit more about. So that's an example you're saying of an objective baseline test that's just going to give you some data.
Point A, point B, long period of time in between. There's other things that you can do in between that are submaximal. So in running, if you hold a given pace and look at your average heart rate after, a mile or two, what's your average heart rate at that pace? If your general aerobic fitness is improving even 3 or 4 weeks later, you should see for the same pace maybe 2 or 3 or 4 beats per minute lower heart rate for the same pace. And so it's not a maximal effort, it's a submaximal, controlled, and just assess objectively a physiological response to a load. In the lab, we can do things, oxygen consumption or lactate or muscle oxygen, but for most people, the basic heart rate, breathing rate, perceived effort, pace or power or speed gives you a really good comparative intermediate check without looking at like maximal effort.
And what about I mean, the flat line is one thing whereby if you were not monitoring, you could be feeling like I'm working, I'm doing the hours, I'm doing the sessions, I'm recovering. You may not notice that you're not improving, but there could be a point where you tip into some degree of overtraining, even at the far end, adrenal fatigue. If you're the kind of person that maybe in an earlier stage, you haven't done so much training, and you just think, I've just got to keep pushing. And actually, you've now gone from a flat curve to a downward curve. What are some of the indicators that, without getting into a lab or drawing blood or anything, that someone could use to say, I'm overcooking myself right now. I actually will do better by not training.
Yep. If you do a bit of a maximal effort, whether, running, that could be a 1 mile all out, or cycling, it could be like a 5-minute max test or like a ramp to max. If your peak heart rate, the highest heart rate that you're used to seeing with maximal effort, that's say 3 to 6 minute long type of effort, if that heart rate is suppressed more than 5 or 6 beats per minute, that's a pretty good indication that things aren't right.
Well,
your heart rate
you
max should not drop.
Right, so you cannot hit your max.
Yep, and that's a big one. Another 2 other things I look at is just straight up motivation. If your motivation, if you have more than 3 days where your motivation is suspect or way below average or really no motivation, that's like a pretty early indicator. A lot of times people will push through that. They have a habit and they're just going to keep doing it. Their training schedule says keep going, and so I'm just going to keep going, and they kind of blow through that. But within a training log, if you kind of look at those kind of things, it can be fairly insightful. For me, when I work with athletes that I see one-on-one, it's sense of humor. When they lose their sense of humor, they're in the crispy side. They may not be fully overtrained or completely overcooked, but they're approaching that point. So when the sense of humor goes, that's a warning of, what? Instead of continuing this block for another week, we're going to pull back early this weekend. And I'm just going to give you 2 or 3 days off. If 2 or 3 days off doesn't allow a rebound, that may be where you're in a deeper hole. Typically, it's a decrease in the capacity to do work is one of your other big things. So if you're used to being able to run a mile in 5.5 minutes and you can't run one under 5:45, your output, basically that's one of the biggest things when you look at overtraining literature. The first thing is the inability to do a workload that you had previously been able to do.
And noticeably so.
Yeah, and again, not like you took off 6 months and you're not fit. It's you've continued to train and now you're less capable of doing something than you were 6 weeks ago or 8 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago even.
Yeah, you're genuinely on the downhill slope. What about for a non-professional athlete, right? At any level, how much impact can the non-sporting life stressors have, whether that be work, family, sleep, people with kids, whatever it may be?
Yeah.
Because we certainly see a lot of athletes on our side here who almost put training and sport on one side and don't think of life being a stress
separate.
as well. That clearly it is, but it's not related. What do you see of the crossover between, let's call them the real world stresses, and our training and sport world stresses? How do they play out?
Yeah. Ultimately, your body doesn't care where that stress came from. Like you can tolerate a certain amount of stress. Let's just say this is your reservoir you can tolerate. And so if training stress is this much of it, and then life stress is this much, it doesn't matter where it came from. If it goes over that, it overflows. It's too much. And so even the term stress, most people always connotate negatively. Well, there's actually eustress, which is eustress, which is the amount of stress that you can apply where when you recover, you adapt and become more capable. And then there's distress, which is an excess of stress where with the same recovery, you do not get better, or in fact, you get worse. And so there is a balancing point. When I work with age group athletes and I'm looking at their training and I see a normal progression, but they're not having the adaptation. First question, how are you sleeping? How's work? How are you eating? what's going on with the family. 9 times out of 10, there's a minimum of one or two of those categories that are haywire, that out of balance. Work demand has gone up. They're not sleeping as well. Other things are going on within family context. And again, their body didn't care where it came from. It became too much. And so the level of training, what I'm going to basically prescribe for them, I said, unless these things are able to be changed in a quick period of time, like now, we need to pull back on some of your training because you're not adapting to the work you're doing. And so if those stressors cannot be mitigated, if we can't take away, you got a work project that's on, that's what it is. And so you're working more hours, or you have your travel schedule is such that, again, you're not getting as much quality sleep as many days a week, and those things you can't change. Okay, we need to alter your training schedule to work with your life. And the two are, again, hand in hand. They cannot just be separated and say, I'm not caring about that stuff because it happens. I'm just going to do my training as I want to. That will lead you down the road to lack of improvements or even potentially failure to some degree.
And loss of sense of humor along the way.
Absolutely. It's an easy one to detect. With a lot of the elite athletes that I've coached and even some of the amateurs over time, I talk to the spouses and say, listen, if they're cranky, acting up, let me know. They may not be putting it down in their training log, but you're going to be the first signal when they're overdone. You'll know it before I do.
They'll be the first on the scene.
Yep.
That's a really, really good point, that, because I think it's easy for people to lose sight of the division between the two things. What you painted there couldn't be a clearer picture of the body doesn't care where it comes from.
Nope.
That's if people take nothing else out of this, that on its own is an absolute golden point. Now, with the professional atmosphere, clearly a big part of elite sport, and one of the biggest changes in the last 30 years has been the removal of the attempt to remove all of that stress from the athlete's life, so that everything the athlete does is focused on training, recovery, and improvement. Now, you've been at the sharp end on that with a number of Olympic athletes, a number of elite pro cyclists, tour riders, world hour record holders, multiple national champions, world champions. There have been plenty of them through there. What have been the sort of big wins that you've seen in that environment that are really pushing the charge at the top end of the sport, where we can say, right, the life stress we're going to take to a minimum. Let's see what the maximum an optimized human being can do. And let's also add in that these are not just optimized human beings who are motivated. They're also, let's just say, at least they are, in the same way you don't make an ideal basketball player, well, they're pretty much the ideal sort of physiology for the sport they're taking on. What have been the big things leading the charge there you see that are really pushing the sport forward?
Yeah, I'd say it's that entire support system to surround the athlete in those positive ways. But it can be that double side, that it is too much. And so in some cases it's talking with folks, and again, if everything's perfect, it's easy. But in reality, the weather is a factor in competition. And so you have to train in bad weather, not wait for perfect weather, or not move and do the year-round summer. Like, there's a lot of triathletes in the past that, have done the, eternal summer. They go to Australia pretty much for the winter, like the North American winter. And it's, there's summer there. And then they come here for our summer, which is then the winter in Australia. And so they were doing eternal summers. But by and large, there's limits if you're not adaptable, if you can't tolerate tough situations, weather being just one of those, whether it's rain in the Tour or the Giro, or the extreme heat in the Vuelta for road cycling, and in triathlon, same thing, whether it's a very windy day in Kona or a very hot day or a cool day, and then the speed comes out. Like, there's very different circumstances that are just simply weather driven that you have to be able to train in those varied environments and be okay with it. For me, if you're always in that perfect environment and you get outside of it, it's just mentally more difficult to kind of embrace that. So in cycling, you have the classics riders that they're hardened to bad weather. If you're going to be racing in Belgium in March, guess what? It's going to be crappy weather a lot of the time, and you just got to be used to it and ready for it and expect it and not get freaked out by it. You put a tour rider in there in March and gray 40-degree rain. Belgium, they're not a very happy person, especially if they're Spanish and they're used to just sun and warm temperatures. So you kind of have to expand those things relative to what that specific goals are. So some cases, I think some athletes have become less resilient as a negative of being so highly tuned to that certain task or couple of tasks.
Because the perfection is built around
perfection
doesn't
so
exist.
Controlled.
And it's almost got too perfect. Is there any backlash against that? What do you do? Just kick them out in the rain? What's that?
Yeah, so it's basically you have increasing specialization and a little less crossover to some degree. And so that's, I think, in some cases, the nature of sport to a degree, that there becomes a little bit more increased specialization, though you still have some riders who have greater capabilities across a range of different conditions. And that's special and exciting to see. Those who have those varied capacities versus then going up against a super specialist. So I think it's an interesting evolution of sport and what's going on, and even say like Ironman and times that people go now. If you think of 10 years ago, going 4 hours for a 70.3, what we used to call half Ironman, right, was like incredibly fast. Now, the women are there compared to where the elite men were there in the past. And so there are some pretty impressive and dramatic shifts that we're seeing in the output from athletes in different things, because just it's changed what is possible. And there's a bit of that mental, whether it's, to Roger Bannister, breaking the 4-minute mile, and then how many people within, a period of time did it. They broke that's possible and people can do it. Or the sub 8 hour Ironman. There have been more people who have done that since. And so,
once the barrier is
difficult.
Pushed, people see that it can be done, but that's an interesting mental switch that gets flipped, isn't it? How do you? Have you worked with athletes who've been the first people across certain barriers like that, and how do they differ from the people who then come after them?
Yeah, there's a bit of that. A great example, Evelyn Stevens, phenomenal cyclist. She came to the sport very late. She played tennis in college, and she was working on Wall Street and got on a bike and did a couple of races. Like, wow, this is kind of fun. And she was very good at it. She went up to be a pro within less than 2 years of her first race on the HTC team, which was phenomenal. But one thing she did, and I think it was in 2015, women's road racing, there aren't grand tours, there aren't 3-week-long races. But she did the women's Giro, the Giro Rosa, 10-day stage race for women, no rest day, and she went directly into the Thüringen race in Germany, started the next day, and that was a 7-day stage race. She won the second stage race. She was top 10 in the Giro overall. She won the second race where there were riders coming in fresh. She rode all the way into that, and it showed, 18 days of racing straight. There are no guys who have even ever done that, because there is no Grand Tour that runs for 18 days before there's a rest day. So has done something that no man has ever done.
Does she?
And successfully, not just like finished, but won the second race.
And where do you think
that's just changing?
Where do you think she, in the same way that you in a way think, well, I can coach hockey or I can do this that has not been done before, or you end up working with athletes that initially you thought, well, I don't know if I could work at that level. That's a thing that happens. In her case, where is the mental switch, do you think, that flips to say, no, I can do this, even though it's not been done before? How does she create that ramp?
Yeah, I think there are some who have just that little bit more innate uh, capacity to just say, yeah, I'm not going to think about it. I'm just going to do it and not be afraid, not be motivated, or not let the fear take away from the motivation to do it. And
And,
so it's like, yeah, I can do that.
and to then
I
go out
mean,
and execute. I mean, because there must have been people saying, you can't do that.
yeah,
It's like some
exactly.
people go, I'm going to do a marathon.
That's
If no
stupid.
one, if no one they know has done a marathon, a lot of people's reaction might be, you can't do that. And often it's not that they don't care, but it's not a helpful input. It's just their
Yeah.
own limitation being passed on to someone else. But she's doing it at a much spikier level.
Yeah, definitely. Where the consequences, everyone sees, right?
Yeah,
That's the thing within elite sport. I mean, every race is you see what they do, what's possible,
yeah.
and did it work or not. And you don't know what didn't work in some cases if something doesn't go well. And there's times where there's actually successful outcomes. The process was not so good to get there. It's like, okay, we need to do this better.
But even though you got the success, if you didn't take the best path to get there, that's got to be really heartening because it's like, well, this can only get better.
There's more.
Yeah,
Exactly. There's more opportunity, and that for me is what's exciting.
yeah. Now,
Yeah.
I have to say the connection that we have originally is through the Sufferfest, which I came to as part of an Ironman build-up because clearly running a company, building a business, it takes a lot of time. But how do I get the maximum bang for buck? Well, turbo seemed like a good idea, particularly because it was London in winter.
Yep.
And, there are other online or training apps that you can use out there. I'd tried several. And the Sufferfest came along, and I was genuinely, I'm a huge fan. And, no money is changing hands here, just in case anyone was wondering. But genuinely, I couldn't find a way that I could get more out of an hour. And I couldn't find a way that seemed to give me so much focus once I'd done the fitness test. That then filtered into all the figures. And I know others will work by FTP or other things, but this just felt like it was something that had come out of an elite level lab. I mean, I'm kind of figuring that what I or anyone could pull out of a Sufferfest session now is not far off. I mean, would have blown away a professional cycling team, what, a decade ago? I mean, you look, wasn't that
Yeah.
long ago that pros were warming up on turbos with manual hand controls on the bars. Now, anyone who's seriously into turbo training would think that's quite archaic already.
Yeah.
So you played a huge part in that translation because you took the knowledge from Apex, the knowledge from your lab, the knowledge from your pro athletes, and then turned that into something that now anyone can pull out through a turbo. How does that transition happen? And how do you think that level does sit in terms of what's available now on a mass market that wasn't, in terms of compared to
Yeah.
what's in the pro sphere even 5 years ago?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is that true just translating and looking at, okay, at the elite level, what have we done? And again, I kind of came into some of the sport, in a way from looking at it through a different class. If you look at, say, Taylor Finney, who I started working with, in 2006 as a 16-year-old who, had parents who were phenomenally successful, right? He's got all the right stuff to start with genetically, and competed as an 18-year-old 2 years later at the Olympic Games in the pursuit. I never raced on the track. I grew up near a velodrome a couple hours from home, but I never went to it. I wish I would have, but he was doing the individual pursuit, which when I broke it down from just a pure kind of, sports science problem, there's aerodynamics and there's power output. There's the standing start element, the fixed gear. And so we didn't have a velodrome that was accessible for us. He was still a high school student. And so we did our training inside for, probably 80% of all of his training, specific track training, was done on a stationary, whether it was the Velotron or his TT bike on, say, a CompuTrainer. And that was, 10, 11 years ago. And, it was like, okay, how do we just do the type of training that they would do on a track, but do it on a stationary, and break out the things that are important and not do the stuff that isn't important, because we had, only so much time to work with. He was, an 18-year-old, and training, 12, 14 hours a week was appropriate training volume for him. Yeah, guys like Bradley Wiggins were racing the tour, and, Hayden Rolston, who was silver medal in 2008, those guys are 20, 30 hours a week of training a week, and Taylor's training less than half of that. But was still competitive. Finished 7th at the Olympics, and then won the elite world title the 2 years after that, in 2009 and 2010. Youngest ever world title holder, and set American records in that, 4:14, which again, guys just started getting to go that fast again recently. So there was almost a 10-year lull in the individual pursuit times at world championships. And so for me, it's just kind of looking at where the opportunities are, and adapting what you have to what the demands are, and, approaching it like that. Just like in Ironman, I've had people that, age groupers that the goal was to break 10 hours, and generally they were training 8 to 12 hours a week. Their entire weekly training was the total volume of what their goal race time was, and be effective with what they've got, and looking at recovery and adaptation. If you're not getting better, what are you doing?
Yeah. So it's as much that one thing I'm really getting clearly here, it is not just training, it's recovery.
Yep, absolutely. So critical. And then on race day, when you come in, if you have confidence in what you've done, more is possible. If you're not confident, not much is possible.
And that is a whole nother can of worms. I would love to do a follow-up to this, Neal, because the number of other avenues we could have gone down here, whether it was the strength avenue. We haven't even touched on food. We've skimmed the surface on sports science, strength, recovery, the whole 9 yards. But the thing I love the most is the energy that you bring to this, because genuinely, either you're an incredible actor, or you are what you look like, which is you are someone who's absolutely in his sweet spot, and that comes shining through. Thank you for making the time in the middle of the Apex training bunker to come and share some of this today. And I hope that we can do a follow-up at some point, because I just think there's so much value for people to take away for their own everyday improvement, whatever they might be training for.
Definitely, Warren. Well, I appreciate you reaching out and having a great conversation here. There's a lot of fun stuff we're able to share.
Well, hopefully we'll get out to Boulder and come and invade your lab there.
That would be excellent.
So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That was the maestro, the coach, the genius, the evil genius that is Neal Henderson. You can check him out via his links on social and otherwise that are in the show notes below. And thank you very much for tuning in. Let us know what you thought. Hope that really gave you a lot of value, because as you may have heard me mention at the beginning of the show, delivering value to athletes is exactly what we're all about at 33, whether that's through sharing great content like this conversation with Neal and getting the knowledge out of someone at that level, bringing it to all of us here through the magic of the internet, or whether it's through delivering the finest in natural performance nutrition, which is exactly what we do in store at 33fuel.com. If you're feeling hungry, if you've got a race coming up, or if your own nutrition is just maybe sticking in your throat or your stomach and you're not too happy about it, well, why not check us out? Thanks very much for joining, and look forward to seeing you on the next one.